Welcome to your very last video lecture of Unit 8. In this very last one, we will be talking about pedigrees. I really like these and I think they are a lot of fun, especially if you know a little bit about your family medical history. And I actually will use something I know about my family history in order to introduce you to these kind of genetic processing maps, if you will. Pedigrees are charts that show the genetic relationship within a family. It's just a way to map out certain genetic things that have happened within a family and also to follow them from generation to generation. It sometimes gives you clues as to whether or not a trait that your family exhibits is recessive or dominant. And a lot of times you're going to use these with diseases and things like that, or at least that's the way we will look at them because they're the easiest ones to look at. A lot of genetic diseases are very evident within a pedigree, and so that's usually what we focus on. Before we get done, we got to talk about the symbols that you use in a pedigree. For the first one, if you are a female, you're always exhibited as a circle. Now, if the circle is empty, this means you are normal. If the circle is filled in, then you have the trait, or you have expressed whatever it is the map is looking at. This is when you show the trait. For my males, you're a box. If you're an open box, you're normal. If you are a colored in box, then you express whatever it is this map is talking about. One other thing with this, and I'm going to leave this kind of separately, is if you are a carrier. If you're a carrier and you're a female, you're a half filled in circle. If you are a male, you can probably already figure it out, you are a half filled in square, and that designates a carrier. If you know those three things, what constitutes a female, what constitutes a male, if they're normal, if they have the disease or the trait that we're looking at, or if they carry that trait, then you can read a pedigree, and they are pretty simple to read. They're just sometimes hard to analyze. In order to kind of give you a background, I am going to talk about a disease that runs in my family, and you guys have heard me mention this before. One disease that runs in my family, cystic fibrosis. This is a disease of the lungs, and usually what it does is it affects the little hairs that line your lungs, the pathway of your lungs, in order to move gunk along and to clean out your lungs and things like that. There is a boo-boo in their genetic makeup, in their DNA, that causes them not to work right. And so they can't constantly, they don't move in a nice fluid manner to clean out your lungs. You are constantly swallowing dirt and gunk from your lungs. It's constantly coming up your trachea, and then it will get pushed over and it will go down your esophagus. Now, this happens deep in your throat, so you don't notice you're doing this. So don't freak out on me or anything like that. But the little hairs will move up balls of gunk, and they will come out of the trachea and then go back down into the esophagus so that they can get taken to your stomach, broken down, and then eventually gotten rid of. In someone that suffers from cystic fibrosis, that doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. So a lot of times, the treatments for cystic fibrosis have gotten much, much better, especially within the last 10 years. When I was a lot younger, the age limit for someone with cystic fibrosis was probably their late teens, and they would usually pass away from secondary infections that they got in their lungs because of the fact that their lungs can't clean themselves. Now, your life expectancy with cystic fibrosis has grown leaps and bounds. I have a friend from high school that has this, and she is now in her early 30s. And so it is dramatically changed in the last 10 to 20 years. Okay, so like I've mentioned in class, this runs in my family, on my mom's side of the family. I'm going to start my pedigree. I'll start with my grandparents. My grandfather was married to my grandmother. Out of this relationship sprung my Aunt Myrna, my Aunt Margie, my Uncle Buddy, and last but not least, my mom. My Aunt Myrna got married to her first husband. She's been married a couple of times. And out of that first relationship, she had 2 little boys. My Aunt Margie married my Uncle Don, and they had my cousin Jennifer and my cousin Donnie. My uncle Buddy married his first wife, my Aunt Joan. They had my cousin Hope and my cousin Louis Oliver. Last but not least, you have my mom, who married my dad. And out of that relationship came my brother Chris and me. Yay! Now, I could keep going with this, and you'll notice as I went through this, all of the lines connect everybody. If you have a horizontal line, that means that person is married to the other person. A vertical line is showing what kids came out of that union. And you keep going and you keep going. If I wanted to, I could kind of squeeze in my sister-in-law down here by me, and then I could put my nephew down here that came out of that union. And I could do that for several different people within this chart. To give you kind of the pedigree of my family, I had 2 cousins that had cystic fibrosis, and they were the ones that came out of my Aunt Myrna's first marriage. They had cystic fibrosis, which means in order to have that, it is a recessive trait. It is a recessive gene. They had to have 2 copies of it. So I know they had to have been little c, little c. I always put a little tail to make my C's look like a 6, so I know they're little. Which means my Aunt Myrna had to have been a carrier, though she doesn't exhibit the disease, and so was her first husband. So that means they had to have been heterozygous. And just by chance, both of my little cousins that came out of that union both happened to get the recessive genes. I never got to meet these 2 little guys. They died long before I was born because my Aunt Myrna is 13 years older than my mom. Just by chance, they happened to get the recessive traits, and they didn't live very long. They both died when they were fairly young. I don't think either one of them made it to the age of 8, if I remember correctly. Now, if we keep going back, somebody, whether it was my grandfather or my grandmother, also must have been a carrier. Recessive diseases can be pretty hard to figure out because they often skip generations. And it's only if by chance that you marry somebody that also is a carrier that it's going to pop up. Otherwise, you're not going to see it. Nobody else in this other side of my family, if you looked at my Aunt Margie's kind of genetic tree, my Uncle Buddy's genetic tree, or my mom's genetic tree, none of us have cystic fibrosis. So I could make guesses about what this pedigree could look like, but I'm not entirely sure because none of us have gotten genetic testing done, but none of us have given rise to a child with cystic fibrosis. That would make it very easy to figure out. Because none of my mom's other siblings had cystic fibrosis or shared it, it's a good chance to think that my grandfather or my grandmother, I'm not really sure which one this would maybe be, one of them had to be a carrier. So I'm just going to say it's my grandma. The other one was probably homozygous dominant without the trait. And it just happened because we do not have a very big occurrence of cystic fibrosis. Just thinking about it and knowing what I know about genetics, this is what I would kind of figure out for my family. The rest of the boxes I can't fill in. I don't know who's a carrier and who is not because nobody else has had cystic fibrosis. But this is just an idea of how you can map out your family if you have a trait, a disease that is evident throughout the generations. In this next picture, we talked about this disease when I was talking about sex-linked traits. We talked about hemophilia. This is a pedigree. Hemophilia was a very big disease for most of the European royal families. Most of the families came from the matriarch of the royal family, Queen Victoria. She gave rise to a lot of the heads of power for Europe during the 17th, 18th century. Now, because they wanted to keep power within family, there was a lot of cousins marrying cousins. When you do that, funky stuff starts to happen. It's not exactly a good thing to marry your cousin. What that usually causes is this kind of explosion of recessive trait diseases and characteristics to start coming out, one of which is hemophilia. If you look at this pedigree, anything filled in was a kid that suffered from hemophilia. If you look at this, what's one thing you notice? Write it down, bring it to class. When you get into class, I will talk about certain other diseases, and I will give you a little bit more information maybe about cystic fibrosis and a couple of other diseases that you can trace really well through a pedigree. And that is where we'll stop.